Well, thank you, Lylan, and thank you, Angie, and thank you for the whole Labrix and Doctors Data team. I am glad to be here and to explain or to just share with you. This is actually, in some ways, she mentioned the lens. This is going to be somewhat a small component or a very short version of what some of the things I spoke there. But this has sort of been something that I've been working on for a long time, this idea of beyond adrenal fatigue, or maybe hopefully we can be past the idea of adrenal fatigue. And hopefully by the time I'm done here, you'll explain why. I'll hopefully understand why I take that position. So, reframing and understanding of stress and the HPA axis is really something I've spent quite a bit of time on over the last, almost 15 years, I guess. So the popular language around stress has really fallen under this idea of adrenal fatigue. And I'm not going to, attack Jim Wilson. I think he did, a service to point out, sort of the effects of stress on human physiology in a more popular way. But the language that he chose, and then the language that everyone else sort of glommed onto, this idea of adrenal fatigue, I think was somewhat unfortunate because I think it framed the issue of stress as an adrenal issue. And I think hopefully by the time we get done here, you'll see that really probably is not, while the adrenal glands are certainly involved, it's not sort of the root cause of the stress-induced issues that we see in most individuals. So this idea is, your adrenals, as if, you have an adrenal problem, or let's talk about your adrenals. Well, the problem is this is highly, highly oversimplified, and I would say mostly wrong, because we're going to see that the adrenal glands don't control the outcomes as much as we think. And I think it very much limits the leverage of real solutions. So if you're going after the wrong target, you're going to often have the wrong solution. So when I say it's oversimplified, it's because adrenal function and or dysfunction is rarely a defining feature or the root cause of stress, of the stress response system dysfunction. So just the idea that if the adrenal glands are failing, sort of like if we think, the pancreas is failing to produce insulin in diabetes, we often think, well, it's the adrenal glands that are failing to produce enough cortisol or DHEA or something like that. And so I think that's why I think it's oversimplified and under leveraged, because I think the most powerful therapies that clinicians can use to support the stress response in the HPA axis are not really, quote, adrenal support therapies. They're really therapies that deal mostly with the brain. So that's really, in a sense, why this is so under leveraged and often overlooked. The other issue is that the term adrenal fatigue, as many of you may know, is actually being sort of targeted by the mainstream individuals, primarily the Hormone Foundation, Endocrine Society, that talk about the idea that adrenal fatigue is not a real medical condition. So, and of course they go on and they actually publish a few things, and they tell you, a doctor that tells you this is, you shouldn't really go to a doctor that's wasting your time on doing this thing. And of course, interestingly for the lab world, in the middle of this adrenal Hormone Foundation statement is, quote, there is no test that can detect adrenal fatigue. Supplements and vitamins made to, quote, treat adrenal fatigue may not be safe. And even taking these supplements, they say, when you don't need them, can cause your adrenal glands to stop working and may put your life in danger. So, I mean, obviously, it's a little hyperbole here. So they went over the top on that. But I will say that, the more popular use of the word adrenal fatigue in the published literature, there are very few instances where this is used. They're almost always sort of in a negative. You can see this one from the South African Medical Journal. We are tired of adrenal fatigue. This other one, adrenal fatigue does not exist, a systematic review. Now, I could critique these two papers because they both are equally wrong in a number of different aspects. But unfortunately, the use of the word adrenal fatigue is mostly used in the literature sort of as a target, as a negative thing. So are these people right? Well, I would say partly. And I would say partly because the term adrenal fatigue does not properly describe the stress response that leads to changes in adrenal hormone output, i.e. cortisol, or even the sense of fatigue. I mean, the relationship between what somebody might deem adrenal fatigue and actual fatigue due to stress is really not clear and certainly not linked very clearly. So I just think we should just stop using this terminology altogether. I've been saying this for probably a decade now. But they are correct, or they are incorrect in their assertion that, one, that long-term stress has no effect on adrenal hormone output. It does. Or that no test is capable of assessing the effects of stress on human physiology, which obviously it does. So the issue is not that we should abandon the idea, but some of the nomenclature is what we should abandon. So I think we need to really rethink how we discuss, quote, adrenals, and start using different terminology. And I say start, hopefully some of you have already been doing that. So I've been doing this. This is sort of one of my, I call it my stressful mission. I've been working on this for quite a while to help realign the functional medicine community to the current research on HPA axis and stress dysfunction. And I know that the people at Labrist and Dr. Dad, as well as other labs, have, because I've been working with many of them, have begun to really rethink about this, and it's really a great response. To expand the view of the HPA axis beyond the stress response. We won't have time to talk about that today, but the HPA axis is really not a stress responder as much as it is a manager of all kinds of metabolism in the body, including circadian rhythm, which we're only going to touch upon today. To help create a common nomenclature around stress and HPA axis function that's useful and accurate within the sort of the healthcare and scientific community, especially the functional medicine community. I've also been trying to encourage more uniformity in the laboratory testing, and that's still taking a while. All the labs like to have their unique way of doing things, which is great, but the researchers in publishing literature are kind of driving some of that and trying to move some of the testing towards what's happening in the literature to increase more research related to testing and HPA axis function, and then also to help clinicians obviously incorporate therapies that are directed to stress and HPA axis dysfunction. Now, this is a little more complicated because we don't see a lot of publications looking at the way that functional medicine clinicians test and think through this with some of the therapies that you were using. So we don't see a lot of published data on that, but there is some, and it's growing. So as Lylan mentioned, this is the second edition, just came out last November. The role of stress in the HPA axis. The first one came out in 2015. You can get the ebook as a PDF. And the expansions from the first book, if you're familiar with the first edition, is I expanded. I have a chapter on the endocannabinoid system, a whole chapter on memory and brain function, on how that's affected by cortisol and other effects of stress, and then a whole chapter on the effects of thyroid or the effects of stress and thyroid and interrelationship. And then I expanded a number of the other components. So I certainly, I guess I can advertise this book in the sense that I certainly can't cover everything that's in this book in our conversation today. So nomenclature does matter. So when we think of primary adrenal insufficiency, obviously it's a real phenomenon. It's really an autoimmune phenomena, relatively uncommon, but it's out there, obviously. But it's not a stress-related chronic disease phenomenon. That is, primary adrenal insufficiency is not due to chronic stress. And so that's a whole other issue. When we think of stress-related changes in adrenal hormone output, they're regulated by the brain. So this isn't a primary adrenal issue. It is a brain, often a downregulating or a modulation that happens in the brain that downregulates CRH and ACTH, which then causes cortisol often to change, going down over time. Ironically, secondary and tertiary adrenal insufficiency, the way that it's normally thought of in the endocrinology world, also is not a adrenal issue. It's a pituitary, typically a pituitary or hypothalamic issue. So unfortunately, the nomenclature even is wrong when we think of this from a broader standpoint as well. But some of those are called secondary and tertiary adrenal insufficiency because they're related to the low cortisol. So I think hopefully everybody has sort of the idea that the adrenals respond to the brain. And so a variety of stress signals create a signal which then produces enough ACTH to trigger the adrenal cortisol output. And of course, there's feedback inhibition. When cortisol is made, it circulates in the body, and the anterior pituitary and the hypothalamus and a number of other aspects, other tissues in the brain have cortisol glucocorticoid receptors, and they're able to then downregulate or modulate the response. And classically, when we think of errors in the sensitivity to the brain to cortisol, you can see sort of the traditional way of thinking. In the middle here, you have patients with major depression. Many patients with major depression have a lack of sensitivity or a downregulated feedback inhibition. And so they don't sense the cortisol as well. And so they upregulate both ACTA, or CRH and ACTH. And so typically people with major depression, adults with major depression, will have elevated cortisol levels. But in PTSD, adults with PTSD, this is not so much in children, but adults with PTSD will often have a hypersensitive cortisol feedback inhibition loop, and they will see cortisol as being hypersensitive, and they will then downregulate CRH and mostly ACTH, and then you'll have patients with PTSD with low cortisol levels. They often will have elevated DHEA levels as well, likely both of these to downregulate or to create a downregulating cortisol to protect tissue from that. So again, remember that the adrenal glands are simply just listening to the brain. So what's the correct terminology? Well, usually I like using this as the by largest sort of catch-all term. Stress-related HPA axis dysfunction. That really is probably the most correct terminology for dealing with anything related to stress that causes changes in the HPA axis. Some people call this maladaptation to stress, or a stress response dysfunction, or whatever. So there's other ways of looking at it. And of course, we've known for many, many years that there's a whole number of disorders that are associated with either an increased activity or a decreased activity of the HPA axis. And we're certainly not going to go through this list. You can see that we don't always know which is the cause and which is the effect, but there's still a relationship between them that, and a patient can go over time, can go from an increased activity of the HPA axis, and then eventually their brain downregulates, and they then move into these other sort of categories where they're associated with a more decreased activity of HPA axis. So there's a whole bunch of other specific terms, but these should only be used where they're appropriate. So if you have somebody with low cortisol levels, you might want to just use hypocortisol. I mean, that's very simple, or elevated cortisol, hypercortisol. Although both of those terms, by the way, are used in the endocrinology world for Cushing's and Addison's. So again, you might want to be careful how you use those terms depending on who you're talking to. But you may have a patient with low DHEA, or if you're measuring sulfate form, low DHEAS. High allostatic load, which is typically what we think of when we think of high amounts of chronic stress or stress burden. Burnout, if it's properly defined as is a downregulation of the HPA axis due to chronic stress. So these are all terms which are used in the literature, which I think clinicians can start using as well. So like I mentioned, what is the goal of the stress response? Well, the goal of the stress response is to bring back proper metabolism and to basically help the organism survive. So when you're in a stress response system, you're trying to maintain blood supply, oxygen, nutrition to the brain, the heart, the skeletal muscle for immediate survival. One of the ways the body does this is to increase energy production by recruiting substrates like glucose, like free fatty acids, like amino acids from body stores. It enhances gluconeogenesis. So this is why somebody can become insulin resistant if they constantly rely upon this, because the body kicks in an insulin resistant phenomena to push more glucose to the brain. You want to optimize your ATP for short-term metabolic function, and you often do that at the expense of long-term metabolic reserves. So if you know anything about Bruce Ames's triage theory, you know that the body can preserve things or set aside long-term issues for short-term needs, and we see that with the metabolism in stress. And so one of the analogies I use with people that aren't as familiar with this idea is, and maybe with patients you could talk about, it's like, you know, everybody has to sort of pull off the side of the road when the emergency vehicles show up. So a lot of your normal metabolic functions need to be set aside when the body needs to deal with the stressor. And because it's the same roads, the same receptors, the same processes that need to go on in order to make that function. So you need to, you know, everything needs to sort of get out of the way. So here's, you know, one of the diagrams that, you know, you're probably familiar with. I'm not going to talk so much about the catecholamine production of epinephrine and norepinephrine, which obviously happens very quickly within seconds, both in the brain and then eventually at the adrenal medulla. But what we're talking more on the right-hand side, where you get this production of corticotropin releasing hormone, CRH, and then ACTH from the anterior pituitary, and then glucocorticoids in humans, that's cortisol. Also DHEA is produced by the adrenal cortex, as is the mineralocorticoids, aldosterone. And so these all are related. Obviously, we're going to talk a little bit about the fact that they're not all regulated the same. But I want to remind you that, you know, this is a somewhat a crude system in some ways. That is, the hypothalamus is actually a number of nuclei that are a number of different bundles of nerves, which are designed to take information from the body and from exterior, things that we're perceiving around us, and consolidating that into a single stress signal, which is supposed to then change the metabolism of the body to deal with what's ever happening. So if you have low blood sugar, if you're hungry, if your body water level is low, if you see something threatening outside of you and your amygdala is telling you to fear that thing, all of that information has to be consolidated into the paraventricular nucleus, which I showed right in the middle, PVN as it often is referred to. And that is also controlled, or there's an overriding signal by the suprachiasmatic nucleus, the SCN, which helps control, based on light, control the system in a circadian pattern. So those two, the paraventricular nucleus and the SCN, the suprachiasmatic nucleus, are the two that you're going to see in some of the other slides that I'm going to mention here in a minute. So as you can see on the very left-hand side, you can see there it is, the SCN, the suprachiasmatic nucleus, funneling into the paraventricular nucleus, along with other parts of the brain, the amygdala, the prefrontal cortex, etc., the hippocampus, bringing all that information into the hypothalamus and triggering that signal. When that signal goes, basically it goes to the pituitary, the anterior pituitary cells, which are shown here, and ACTH is preformed, released very quickly, and then obviously that goes to the adrenal gland to turn on the cortisol. I just want to mention the fact that CRH is within a family of signaling molecules called urocortins. And while we don't have time to certainly get into this today, I want to mention a little bit of information, because this is where the stress data or the stress information is being expanded in the literature. That is comparing CRF or CRH, same thing, with other urocortins binding to two different types of receptors. CRH receptor type 1 is the ACTH receptor in the pituitary gland, but you can see there's some crossover between these and other urocortins and other types of CRF or CRH receptors. The reason that's important is because CRH and urocortin receptors are found not only throughout the brain, but they're also found in a number of different tissues. You can see here in muscle tissues, in endogenous ligands, like so in the skin, adrenal glands, ovaries, heart, gastrointestinal tract. And so that we now know that CRH is not only a signal for the stress response, but there's a signal all over the body. And as it turns out, CRH is also produced in other tissues, especially immune tissues. So what we're learning about CRH is actually changing the way we think about the stress response or other responses in the body related to a stressor within the immune system and within the GI tract, especially. So For instance, CRH in immune cells, not only do they have receptors, but you can induce CRH production in mast cells and in macrophages. So in the innate immune system has a way to signal CRH within other tissues, probably in the GI tract as well. And so that's why we see probably a stress-induced or a stress-modulated effect by CRH as well. I don't have time to get into this, but it's very interesting. The skin has its own production of CRH, ACTH, and cortisol. All can be made in the skin because it's got its own sort of stress response system inside of it. Anyway, the adrenal gland, remember the adrenal gland is multi-layered. So even the adrenal cortex, the zona fasciculata, which produces cortisol, the zona reticularis produces DHEA. They are two different tissue types produced embryologically as different tissues. And why that's important is because many people teach, I think, this idea of Pregnenolone steal. Probably many of you heard Pregnenolone steal, and I don't know, I know some of the labs are still talking about this, so I just want to say that when I really studied the idea of Pregnenolone steal, it really fundamentally, metabolically cannot occur. And the reason is because if you teach steroidogenesis like this, where you separate out each of the tissue types, each of these are steroidogenic cells that they can produce pregnenolone from cortisol in the mitochondria, and they have different enzymes, so they end up producing different hormones. And so there's no way to steal the pregnenolone produced, let's say, by the zona reticularis and steal it away to produce cortisol in the fasciculata. So the idea that happens, that there's one pool of pregnenolone, really mostly is in the mind of clinicians when they see the one picture where all of the hormones, whether it's estrogens or testosterone or cortisol, all coming from one big, biochemical chart. Well, as it turns out, that may be helpful in understanding what enzymes do, but it's not necessarily helping in understanding what cells do because they can't share these enzymes with each other. So hopefully, while it's true that stress that induces elevated cortisol can also deplete DHEA, that phenomena is due not to a stealing of pregnenolone, but other signals that are going on in these tissues in the adrenal gland. So probably one area that I spent quite a bit of time on, and I think it kind of is surprising to clinicians, and maybe it helps understand why measuring cortisol is only part of the issue, is that cortisol signaling is multifaceted. That is, if you just know how much cortisol is there, that doesn't necessarily tell you how each tissue is going to respond to that cortisol, because there are many different things that can happen within the body and at the cell surface that change the available cortisol signal that's there. And some of it, like I said, is systemic, but much of it is tissue specific. And again, because of the time we have, I'm not going to go through these in detail, but for instance, cortisol is metabolized. So the cortisol metabolism rate, the amount of free versus bound cortisol, most of this is bound by corticosteroid binding globulin. The conversion of cortisol to cortisone using the two enzymes, 11-beta hydroxy dehydrogenase, 1 and 2. The whole classic genomic glucocorticoid signaling and different expressions of glucocorticoid receptors. There's a whole, actually quite a few different ways of splicing the glucocorticoid receptor before it's expressed, which changes sensitivity. The expression of heat shock proteins, non-genomic signaling, so that we know that there's cortisol triggering cell changes without actually binding to the glucocorticoid receptor, and then DHEA, which acts as a counter-regulatory hormone. So I've got a whole section in the book that uses this graphic and breaks each of these areas down to explain them, not only to explain how they all work and how they relate with one another, but how different parts of how different tissues can modulate the effects of the glucocorticoid signaling over time. And of course, when this happens in the peripheral tissues, like say the muscles or adipose tissue or other glands, that can change cortisol sensitivity. But when that happens in the brain, especially at the hypothalamus and pituitary level, it actually changes the HPA axis's sensitivity to cortisol, which then has more global implications. So there's a lot going on, and I apologize that we can't get into all of the details, but I can tell you that this is some very interesting part of the research, especially when it comes to the expression and polymorphisms of heat shock proteins, because they actually bind with the glucocorticoid receptor to cortisol and affect the sensitivity of each tissue, or the potential sensitivity of each tissue to cortisol. One thing that's interesting is people have been exploring the idea that cortisol may influence mitochondrial function. We know it does, although for many years they were looking for a mitochondrial glucocorticoid receptor signal. As it turns out, it does not look like there's a putative glucocorticoid receptor that modulates mitochondrial DNA, but it looks like cortisol can still migrate into the mitochondria and affect gene expression in the mitochondria in a slightly different way than it does in the nucleus. And why that's so important is, remember, glucocorticoids were named because they were glucose modulating hormones. And so we know that metabolism and glucose function is modulated at the mitochondrial level by cortisol. And so we know that you can create sort of a stress response within the cell. A lot of this is driven by the mitochondrial, not only mitochondrial function, but actually mitochondrial shape. Actually, we know that you can get metabolically stressed mitochondria. They go into these small little, they go through fission, and then you have these smaller mitochondria that produce more reactive oxygen species, less ATP, and create more metabolic stress on those tissues. So we do know that there is quite a bit of influence, and likely this is one of the connections between why you have a lower ATP production and a lower or higher amount of fatigue, physical fatigue, when you go into chronic stress. It's probably a mitochondrial type issue. So when you think of this, think of stress always as a biphasic response. The body has really good, it knows how to handle acute stressors over a short period of time very well. Mitochondria can do this. They produce more ATP. They produce more ways of quenching free radicals. But as stress gets more and more chronic, there's changes within the cells, likely has to do with glucocorticoid receptor sensitivity, which then changes the way the cell functions, and the mitochondria then are less capable of quenching free radicals, and then create some of the problems that we see with chronic stress. So as we start thinking about solutions, if we're changing our thinking about the adrenal glands, we need to then stop thinking about just ways of fixing the adrenals. And we need to ask a broader question, which is, what makes the brain feel stressed? Or what is the driver? From a more technical standpoint, what are the drivers of the HPA axis? And over time, I've kind of concluded with, looking at this for the last decade, that almost all of the HPA axis stressors can be boiled down into one of these four categories. Those things that are driven by perceived stress, those things that disrupt circadian rhythm, those things that interrupt or change glycemic dysregulation, and that can be hyperglycemia or hypoglycemia, and obviously going between the two is really bad. And then inflammatory signals, TNF alpha, IL-6, and IL-1 beta, as you know, are very strong inflammatory mediators, but they're also very strong upregulators of CRH. And so if you have a way to assess these four areas of a patient's life, you can get a handle, and hopefully you have therapies that can help deal with these four areas. You can probably deal with 80% of the drivers, maybe 90% of the drivers of their stress. Now, obviously, perceived stress is multi-layered. I don't have time, again, to get into this too much, but perceived stress is influenced by neurotransmitters as well as neurosteroids, but it also is dealt with, anxiety, depression, other signals that come to the patient, as well as their perception of their environment around them, learned behavior, things like that as well. So again, if you have lifestyle and nutrient therapies to reduce these key drivers of the HPA axis, you really have, you've got what the tools that you need really to deal with most of the issues. This is where the delicate dance is between the clinician and the patient, is trying to really assess this, get them to understand what's really driving their stressors, and then looking at ways of changing that. So for those of you who aren't familiar with some of the how the body converts external events into internal signals, the areas that have been studied the most as far as events that are in someone's life that are the most stressful are those that are new, so things that are novel, things that are unpredictable, things that bring threat to them or their ego. So, if I show up somewhere and somebody's wearing the same color dress that I am, or the same hat that I'm wearing, then I might be stressed out about that, or anything where you lack control. So if somebody loses control over their situation, that is going to be perceived by them as a stressor. So public speaking, for some people, is going to be a high stress environment, whereas other people, public speaking is not, because it's not new, it's not, they have predictability, it doesn't threaten them, etc. So these are things that, and there's a number of different questionnaires that you can use. The perceived stress scale is the classic one, and almost all the questions on the perceived stress scale talk about how well do you feel in control of this aspect of your life, your finances, your relationships, your employment, et cetera, et cetera. I mentioned here neurosteroids. I'm assuming most of you are familiar with neurotransmitters, but other people are not as familiar with neurosteroids. As it turns out, the brain, many tissues in the brain, can produce steroids. They can produce Pregnenolone, they can produce DHEA, they can produce Pregnenolone, some of these others that are listed here, but mostly Pregnenolone, Pregnenolone sulfate, DHEA, and DHEA sulfate. And as it turns out, as these are made in the brain, they can actually modulate the NMDA receptor and the GABA receptors, changing their sensitivity. And you can see also estradiol listed there as well. So this is sort of a newer area of research as we're trying to figure out how neurosteroids, the endocannabinoid system, and neurotransmitters all influence the translation between how an event is translated chemically into a stress signal. And so as it turns out, for instance, most of the Pregnenolone that most people take as a supplement more likely gets into the brain and acts as a neurosteroid than gets into the adrenal gland and is converted into either DHEA or cortisol. Most people don't know that, but it still can modulate the HPA axis, but likely does that by actually going into the brain. So circadian disruption, and obviously this can be anything that disrupts circadian levels, whether it's sleep deprivation. Even one single night of major sleep deprivation can be sensed in a cortisol the next day. Phase shifter, jet lag, daylight savings, obviously can have a major effect on the body, as well as shift work. People always ask me, if I have somebody working shift or, swing shifts or something, when should they do their cortisol test? And I would say, I'm not sure it's going to matter, because as long as they're on swing shift, they're going to have issues. And maybe you can nuance, in your testing and figure that out, but it's going to be pretty hard either way if they're going to stay on swing shift. So why is there such a strong connection between the HPA axis and circadian rhythm? Well, it basically goes to this. There's a very simplistic way of looking at it. Here's the suprachiasmatic nucleus. Basically triggers feeding response. It triggers glucocorticoid. It triggers body temperature and autonomic innervation, including not only to tissues, but specifically to the adrenal gland as well. So when you see these two signals coming from light, you're going to see that one of the ways that the suprachiasmatic nucleus triggers the tissue in its metabolic function is through cortisol. So it does that through the HPA axis. So you have these two aspects going on. You have stressors, which can occur at any time of the day, and then you have this sort of consolidated signal that's triggered by the rhythm of light that is coming from the optic nerve, going through the suprachiasmatic nucleus, and then triggering that same function. And so you see, you have this light dark cycle, and then this regulatory aspect of the HPA axis, and then they talk back and forth to one another, usually at the peripheral clock level. That is at the circadian clocks within the cells, within other tissues, within the main target tissues of the body. I normally teach, and I've got some slides, or some graphics in the book that actually shows specifically how cortisol and other signals bind specifically to the clock genes. I'm not going to do that here, but I want to ask one question. Why would you want your stress response signal to manage your circadian rhythm? Wouldn't it really mess everything up if all of a sudden I wake up in the morning and I have no stress one day and I have a major stressor the other day? Am I going to just mess up my whole circadian rhythm every time I have a stressor? Well, thankfully not. And the reason is because there's a lot more nuance going on. Most of you understand how cortisol goes up and then it comes down, ACTH goes up and it comes down in the morning and it comes back down. What you don't realize, maybe you do realize, but what we often don't know is there's actually small little tiny pulses that come out of the HPA axis. They're very imperceptible unless you're taking, blood samples like all the time, continuously. You really can't measure this in saliva because it's too kind of broad of a measurement. But if you were measuring it, you'd see little pulses. And those little pulses are the way that a tissue knows whether this is a circadian signal or whether this is a stress signal. And so as it turns out, if you have a major stressor, an acute stressor, it's not going to cause you to, your whole system to be messed up. So that's one of the ways that you want to do that. But the other reason is because cortisol is a metabolic hormone. And there are certain things that you want to have happen metabolically in the morning that are different than in the middle of the day. So you want to use your metabolic system. In this case, glucocorticoids are a metabolic regulating system. You want to use those in a circadian fashion so that they're both going on at the same time. As it turns out, chronic stress, however, does mess things up. Remember I said chronic stress changes the glucocorticoid signaling over time in tissues. And so that will slowly create a circadian dysrhythmia. Now, I just put in a blue box at the bottom, something important. The suprachiasmatic nucleus and the pineal gland, which produces melatonin, do not have glucocorticoid receptors. So they cannot be messed up, as it were, by excess cortisol production. So they are an independent signal feeding into the HPA axis, not receiving a signal back from it. And that's a protection against this whole system going awry at the top level. So how can, what are some of the things that can affect in an acute way? Well, exercise is a normal HPA axis triggering. So on the left-hand side shows, two different groups of young athletes. These are trained soccer players who are taking salivary cortisol. You can see the cortisol awakening response in the morning, quite robust. And then based on when they exercise, those that exercise in the morning are in blue and those that exercise in the afternoon are in orange. And you can see that immediately after they exercise, you see a spike in cortisol. Well, that's normal because they are creating a metabolic need in the body, which is going to be triggered by a cortisol or an HPA axis response. That's normal. Actually, in older people, that flattens out more and more. You actually want to see a robust cortisol awakening, a cortisol response to exercise. And of course, you also want to make sure that when a patient is taking their test, that they understand that relationship and don't sample at the wrong time. You can see on the right-hand side what happens at a marathon. The reason that you get immune suppression and circadian problems and GI problems and all kinds of issues after an extraneous thing like a marathon is, look what happens to the cortisol level. It spikes very, very high. And so those individuals need to obviously know that, but they also need to have some sort of recovery plan for that from a metabolic standpoint. So as we start thinking differently about the HPA axis more broadly as an energy management system, it's obvious why we want to upregulate metabolic systems to coincide with diurnal activities. So in the morning when you're waking up and you're going to do things, you want to have your cortisol coming down, you're going to turn things on, and you're going to want to have sugar coming in, a meal. Modulate cell metabolism in anticipation of energy availability, prepares immune functions for increased vulnerability. So cortisol goes down, immune systems go up as you're going to become active in the day. And of course, in an emergency, we're going to shove that aside and we're going to focus just on the emergency, but that's not hopefully the primary use. So you can understand why personalized lifestyle medicine is really the idea of prioritizing both the types of signals and their timing. So you can't just get all the right signals and get them all at the wrong time. You want to be able to create the right signals of diet, physical activity, stress response, circadian signals, environmental signals, etc., at the right time during the day. And for those of you, I don't know if you still have access to the Lens material, but I actually talked quite a bit about that in there as far as eating timing with this as well. And then last, we want to talk about the inflammatory signals, things like inflammatory bowel disease, chronic joint inflammation, food allergies, chronic sinusitis, allergic inflammation, even obesity. Obesity is an adipose-driven inflammatory condition. And so anytime you're thinking about somebody who has chronic inflammation, somebody with rheumatoid arthritis for 20 years is probably going to have their HPA axis probably completely over in what some people call stage 3. I don't necessarily like using stages because it's not as clear as that in the literature, but the idea of stage 3, or where they're having very low cortisol, very low DHEA because the brain has downregulated the system for so long. So then that brings me to the question, we're nearing the end here, where, what can we do? And this is where you need to be thinking about really 3 different categories or strategic areas of modulating the HPA axis. Many of the things that we can do are related to the support of the brain, the central nervous system support. And those would include maintaining appropriate hypothalamus response to stressors. Like I said, if you're dealing with glycemic dysregulation, reducing perceived stressors, reducing inflammatory signaling, and increasing the appropriate circadian signals. Those are going to probably be your largest levers that you can have. Balancing neurotransmitters, maybe neurosteroids if we know how to do that. Maybe supplementing some of the precursors like Pregnenolone. Maybe supplementing DHEA where necessary and where physiologically appropriate, and maybe Pregnenolone as well. And then there may be some balancing effects that can be done with elevated cortisol using phosphatidylserine, which we believe helps the sensitivity of the brain to cortisol and then creates a downregulation. Adaptogens, we really don't know that much about how adaptogens work, to be honest. We know that they modulate some heat shock proteins and maybe some other signals. So we believe they work at the brain level primarily. And then I'm going to move to the right-hand side, and I'm going to show you that target tissue cortisol modulation. Can we downregulate 11-beta HSD1? This is kind of a big area in the drug research world, but the way that we can do that is we can reduce inflammation, we can reduce insulin resistance, reduce central adiposity, and consider moderate exercise. All of these have been shown to downregulate 11-beta HSD1, which will reduce the conversion of cortisone to cortisol. Maybe we can increase heat shock proteins by adaptogens. Again, physical activity is another thing that increases adaptogen synthesis. Or consider supplementing DHEA again, because DHEA is a modulator to elevated cortisol. And so you really want to make sure you don't have a cortisol dominance for a long period of time, because that's where you get the downregulation to occur. And then in the middle, we have, maybe what we could call traditional adrenal support. We know that there are some nutrients that maybe can help steroidogenesis. So adrenal steroidogenesis, vitamin C, some B vitamins, maybe some minerals. You notice glandulars, there's kind of a debate on whether using adrenal glandulars are helpful. There's really 0 published data on the use of glandulars, except for glandulars where adrenaline, where we use epinephrine or norepinephrine, but really not for cortisol at all. And then maybe antioxidants or adaptogens are going to be helpful there as well. I'm actually very interested in looking at what we can do to protect the zona reticularis. We don't know much about that in humans. It's the DHEA producing component, because it does seem to be very sensitive to chronic stress. And if you downregulate DHEA early, then you get more cortisol going to the brain. We don't know if the brain level of DHEA is upregulated because we don't have a way of knowing and testing that. And so once you have cortisol dominance in the brain, it exacerbates the downregulation of the HPA axis over time. So again, I would say always thinking about these 4 key areas of stressor are really, from a functional medicine standpoint, going to be your bread and butter areas. What you can do with supplements is very little if you can't really deal with those things first. Once you begin dealing with those things, and of course, in some cases, like c-Myc dysregulation, maybe supplements will help there as well. But once you've dealt with some of those things, then the HPA axis is probably going to respond to your other things much better. So again, if you weren't here before, much of this information, much of what I've tried to work over the years has been published in this new book. So I'm willing to take some questions. If I can answer them, I'll try. If not, maybe I can email them afterwards, and then they can pass them out. So Leyland, if you want to jump in here, that'd be great. Bye.